There's a storm coming, so I thought I'd get the cool lightning in the background before it hits. Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in to the last video of the Excalibur trilogy. I'm Kayla with McNerdy Costumes and Props, and today we're going to be finishing the outside of the stone in this video series. This project has tested my skills in every way imaginable. Between learning all of the new skills and between the lack of products coming in, it's just been unreal. I need a lot of plastic for this project, and sadly, I had a really hard time acquiring it. According to a study published by the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, 37% of all of the waste produced in Nebraska is recycled materials. We have one of the lowest recycling rates in the nation, while also being one of the highest in waste production. I'm not going to show you a bunch of pictures of sea turtles with plastic rings around their neck. I'm sure you're all aware of the issue plaguing our nation, and you all love animals. But I am setting a goal for myself to save 1 ton of plastic from being sent to the landfill. So far, over the last few months, I've saved over 100 pounds of plastic, and I will save even more as I continue to work on future projects. Currently, as COVID-19 is still an issue, the limited access anyone in my area had to recycling facilities is now nearly non-existent. I'm working to change that, and I can't wait to help make Nebraska a more beautiful place. But for this project, there's a lot to do, so I'm just going to dive right into it.
So I needed a lot of plastic to be able to make the shell for this rock. I'd spent weeks before this cutting up plastic by hand until I wised up and stopped using the tin snips and decided to opt for a paper shredder instead. I broke down the plastic into smaller pieces to be able to fit inside the paper shredder. This is a long and tedious process, but it's all worth it in the end when I open up the drawer to reveal all of my shredded up plastic. So I know this looks terrible, but I modified the paper shredder to be able to put in bigger pieces. For the polystyrene in particular, it flies everywhere, so I needed a hopper to help keep it contained. I do this for every type of plastic I have possible. I make sure to keep the different types separated and labeled, and then I have a little storage container that I keep all of them in. I attempted to shrink wrap plastic bags around the rock, but it didn't work out so well. The first plastic I wanted to try melting was polystyrene. Luckily, you don't need heat to do this, it just melts in acetone. These happen to be old Solo cups left over from a party that I'd had at my place. Just stir them up to get them all coated and then mold it together like a putty. It creates a very nice and workable material to be able to texture onto the rock. Once I'm satisfied that it has been kneaded enough and the acetone is mostly evaporated off of it, I texture it right onto the side. Now that I know that it works, I began applying it to the top of the rock. This also happens to work with the pink insulation foam that construction workers use to insulate houses. Don't worry, the bubbles aren't from an exothermic or endothermic reaction. It's not releasing off any harmful chemicals. It's just releasing the air out of the foam itself. It also works with white styrofoam. I've also heard this works with gasoline as well, but I'd prefer to smell like acetone rather than gasoline. It takes quite a bit of foam to get to this point because it's so aerated, but I absolutely love the putty that comes off of this. It reminds me of the consistency of slime, if you've ever done that sort of art project with your kids. It was too runny to go onto the outside of the rock yet, so I mixed in some of the pieces of the cups to see if this would help. It did not help. It kept dripping over the sides of the rock and even started melting my gloves. In order to make this material usable, I had to think of a way to keep it from dripping down the sides and sliming everywhere. I hit it with a heat gun to see if that would help dry it out a bit, and I was pleasantly surprised by the super cool texture that came out of it. Disclaimer here, I'm not entirely sure if this is safe, but man is it cool. In light of that discovery, I wanted to use some kind of other plastic underneath since it didn't seem to be strong enough to support the weight. The electric skillet didn't work because it needed to be heated on both sides. I've had this tiny little toaster oven for like a decade from my first apartment, and I had no idea what other use it would have. I also used an old George Foreman to try and get the heat on both sides of the plastic. I've heard HDPE is the easiest to work with and melt, so I tried that first. After about 10 minutes, the HDPE was melted and ready to get applied to the rock. I also wanted to attempt some other plastics too, so I decided to try out these bottle caps in my little toaster oven. These took quite a while to melt, over half an hour. I also wanted to try PET because that's what I had the most of, but it proved to be a very difficult process. PET requires a lot higher temperature than most of the other plastics I'm working with, so this turned out to be a fail. Okay, so in here, I've got the HDPE about ready to come out in the little toaster oven I showed you earlier. I've got the polypropylene because the polypropylene sticks to the parchment paper
until it's cool. So I have to have it not have anything on the top of it. So I just take it out of the toaster oven, stick it on the rock, and then when it's cool, I can just peel the paper off. This one, HDPE, does not do that. So that's definitely nice. So this one peels right off. So I just take it over. And I try to find spots that kind of have a gap right here because this one is definitely more rigid than the other plastics. So I'll try to find a spot where it's definitely needed the most. I stick it on there. Give it a minute to kind of take shape and squeeze in between the cracks. Making a liar out of me with the sticking. When it dries, it shrinks, so it's going to stick on there much better when it's dry. Right now, it's still melty and wanting to take it wherever gravity wants. But as soon as it dries, it's super rigid and it flows into the, and when it shrinks, it'll wrap around that chicken wire, so it sticks in there pretty good. I am texturing the polystyrene mixture onto here. So underneath here, we've got the polypropylene. It's really rigid, but it doesn't really have any kind of interesting texture. And so now this gets textured onto here to cover it. And then when I hit it with the heat gun, it gives it this super awesome, like rocky looking texture. So as soon as I'm done with this, I'm gonna hit it with a heat gun to give it that bumpy texture over the top, and it's really gonna look super rocky. So the project is on hold currently at the moment. I never thought I'd say this, but I've run out of plastic. Like all the stuff I've collected over the last few months, it's all gone onto the rock, which it's amazing. Like it's just beautiful and I'm loving it, but I've got that much more to go. So while I'm waiting for more plastic, I've also picked up an old oven to be able to melt in bigger quantities, but I've got to pick that up too. And I have nowhere to put it. My garage is so full that I just have no place to work. I have no place to put it. And I'm still waiting on plastic anyway. So I figured today would be a garage cleaning day. All right, so I got my oven working and I worked for about 3 hours last night. And here is the result. These sheets, these large sheets are so much nicer for putting on here than going little tiny 4x4 sheet at a time. And these only take 5 minutes to melt. So these ones I think turned out especially cool, all the bottle caps. But this will all get filled in with that that mixture of the number 6, the polystyrene, and the acetone putty. I don't even know what you call that. But unfortunately right now it has some of this in polypropylene, but that is it. All right, so over here, here's my giant box of PET. Unfortunately, I don't have a way to process it. Because in the oven at the proper melting temperature, it just becomes this brittle stuff that sticks to the paper, but won't stick to anything else. So I'm going to attempt to try to melt it in a pot with constantly stirring to see if that makes any difference. Okay, and I've got both doors open for ventilation because this is gonna be one stinky, smoky mess. Overall, the PET is a lot of work, but I really think it would be awesome to explore the opportunities with this stuff. Being notoriously difficult to work with, most people don't even bother. But me, I like the idea of taking a challenge and taking a problem child and bending it to my own will. I tried first to slowly crank up the heat just little by little until I could get the plastic to all bind together in a little ball. Then I had to work quickly so it didn't cool as I was trying to texture it onto the rock.
When it dried, it did kind of flake like it did off of the paper, so I had to try something else. I added some of the sifted sand that I used in my casting as a binder. The sand helped it hold its structure a little bit better. It also gave me a little bit more cooling time to work with it, but unfortunately this was very, very time consuming. It took me about 15 minutes to work just this tiny amount of plastic. The window of opportunity for the perfect consistency was also too small. This one right here was the only batch that I managed to get to a putty, workable-like state. The rest was either too thick to texture onto the rock or way too runny. I know I have plans for this stuff in the future, but not for this project. This plastic is also super hot. Right here is a perfect example of why personal protective equipment is essential. Sounds like popcorn. I love the sound of paper releasing from the polypropylene. Okay, things are getting weird right now. I'm exhausted. It is now midnight on day 5. I think now would be a good time to note also that the people that recycle plastic frequently are probably screaming at me right now. If I had another choice, I wouldn't be mixing all of these plastics together. Ideally, I would have liked to have stuck to one. That way I could take it apart and re-recycle it if need be. But because I was going through so much plastic, I had to change my plan. I promise you, this stone will never end up in a landfill in my lifetime. I'm building it specifically so if I'm not using it for its intended purpose, it will be a lovely lawn ornament. Since my attempts at making PET work for this project, I've had to resort to just using the other plastics. Though they were starting to give me trouble as well. That's another thing. With all of the problems getting a hold of plastic, even just recycled plastic that people throw away. I've been dumpster diving and I'm at friends' houses cleaning up. That's not me. If you know me, I don't clean, ever. I cleaned out my basement. I cleaned out my shed. I cleaned out my garage, just looking for pieces that I could use. And it just takes so long to put this plastic on here. And right about this part of the project where I'm like 3/4 of the way through, every time I've got a massive project I'm doing, about 3/4 of the way through, I start to feel this burnout where I'm like, oh, I cannot get this done. When is this ever going to be done? And then I feel that feeling that I just want to give up. But no, not giving up, not giving up. Because I had some wonderful friends. I reached out on my social media yet again, begging for help. Give me your trash, please. And thankfully, I've had some wonderful people respond and help me out and do everything they could to help me keep this project trucking and rolling. Oh, my goodness. So I'm going to keep working. And hopefully the next time I see you will be when I have all of this rigid plastic all the way around this thing. And I can finally take the shell off. Like unwrapping a beautiful gift. Yes, I know. Oh, oh God. Oh, God, you ridiculous dog. Could have broke my phone, you know that? I was away from you for 20 minutes. That's all you've been inside. Look at that. Let me drop my phone. I can hear you. Jesus Christ, where are you? There you are. Die, you winged spawn of Satan. You know, it's come to that point. My grandma used to say, when I was growing up, you know, sometimes you gotta be mean to get your point across because some people just don't listen. Rock, are you gonna start listening to me? Are you gonna stop being a pain in my butt? No? What's that? No? All right then. So I've collected every bit of tape in this house. It will listen to me. At the point that I started putting the plastic about halfway down the rock, gravity started working against me. I couldn't get the rigid plastics like HDPE and polypropylene to stick to save my life. So I decided to put tape and other plastic around the outside to hold the chicken wire in shape as I took the shell off. All right, it is all wrapped up. And I think that's about the best I'm gonna get it for the moment. I'm gonna go in on the inside first and put some sort of rigid shell on the inside. I'd like to use fiberglass, but that's really expensive. I didn't realize this until after I'd wrapped it, that this has to be left free so I can pull the bags out. And not only that, that's my access hole for all the equipment inside. So that was fun. But we'll figure it out one way or another. Let's do this. And now here you can laugh at me struggling for about 45 minutes trying to figure out how to get this heavy shell off. Eventually it did come off, but it was a huge pain. I definitely wasn't expecting just how heavy this would be. I'm hoping once I get it a little more rigid, it won't be quite so cumbersome. Now I can get extra strength and structure from the inside as well. And here is the progress so far. I'm getting more polypropylene put down there at the bottom. And I gotta go all the way around the back and keep texturing on more of that polystyrene and getting closer. I've got it propped up on this barrel for the moment to get it up off the ground, but project's trucking along. I take it back, this is the most excited I've ever been to receive trash. You said you wanted to make slime.
Yeah.
Well, we made slime.
Yeah.
And here is the last of the goop going on. I'm so excited. All right, so here is the award ceremony for the different types of plastics. They have been ranked by their usability in my project only. 7th place goes to PVC, number 3. 7th place is awarded to PVC because I did not use it. It puts off toxic chemicals when burned. And for being about as useless and toxic as my ex, 7th place goes to number 3. Sixth place goes to number 7, other. So number 7 was not completely useless. I used the containers of number 7 to store the different types of plastics. So the award of 6th place goes to number 7, other. Fifth place goes to number 1, PET. Number 1 was not completely useless and will have uses in other projects, but because of the little amount that I put on there, 5th place goes to PET. My kid decided to help me make these beautiful ribbons. Okay, 4th place goes to number 4, LDPE. LDPE was not entirely useless in this project. It did start out on the bottom of the chicken wire, but yeah, it wasn't the greatest.
Yeah, and 4 to 4.
4 to 4, yes. 4th place to number 4. 3rd place goes to number 2, HDPE. HDPE was a little bit difficult to work with as it didn't want to stick to the chicken wire. However, it did work for a little while. All right, and the award of 2nd place goes to, drum roll, number 6, polystyrene. Polystyrene has created the wonderful texture on the rock. The only reason it did not win first is because of just how runny it sometimes got working with it. And there we go. That means 1st place goes to what, kiddo?
Polypropylene.
Yeah. What number is it?
Number 5.
Number 5. Polypropylene.
Yeah.
I may go over this with another layer yet, but I've got that left to finish up once I've got it around the mechanism. And I just need to give this a couple of days to dry off. And we are ready to go. Thankfully, I had enough styrofoam to go over it with another layer. All said and done, I used 6 gallons of acetone. I placed the shell back on top of the clamping mechanism and textured all around where the sword would go to make sure it fit in the right spot. Now I just had to figure out what I was going to do for the access door. After accidentally getting some on my pants, I realized just how well the stuff sticks to fabric. I let it dry and hit it with a heat gun to help it retain its shape. To seal the whole thing in for painting, I decided to use Flex Seal. Experience has taught me to always do a test patch of paints beforehand, and I'm glad that I did because the stuff was just too porous to dry. I decided to go over it with a layer of wood glue beforehand to give it a nice smooth paintable surface. Here I'm just adding some water to water it down to avoid brush strokes on the finished product. After 2 coats of wood glue, it was all dry and ready for the Flex Seal to be applied. The Flex Seal will provide a moisture-resistant barrier and a material that's already designed to be outdoors for hours at a time. The gray also works as a base coat and a primer. After 2 coats, it's now dry and ready to paint. The access door also worked really well with the fabric. I'm going to explore opportunities with this in the future as it remains strong yet still flexible. I'll attach it with Velcro later on after the paint is finished. I use these metallic Rust-Oleum paints often when I'm painting faux armor. I started by using the darker color first, called pewter. The technique I'm using here is called dry brushing. It involves wiping off most of the paint off the brush and then just skimming it over the surface to hit the raised portions. This technique keeps the base color there in the low spots, but then hits the highlights and brings them forward so that they catch the eye. I did this in a couple of layers to achieve the look that I wanted. It appears a little bit too shiny, but it's not overwhelming. King Arthur wouldn't have just jammed his sword into any old rock. He would have chosen one that shined in the sunlight. One that looked worthy to hold Excalibur. This process took several hours to do, and so I moved into a spot where it could be seen in the sunlight. And now I'm using the sterling silver color to go over and just barely hit the highlights. This technique is even more subtle than the first. You probably can't tell on camera how well it's doing. The key is to be as random and haphazard as possible, going over each spot in multiple different directions. It also helped tone down the darker color of the pewter. Spots where I'd applied it a little too heavily and became stark in contrast became virtually non-existent as the silver was almost the same color as the primer, just a little shinier. And now I'm moving on to my absolute favorite step of every project I ever do, the weathering. Weathering involves giving a realistic feel to the prop. Here I'm using a color called burnt sienna to give it the look that it's been sitting outside for centuries, untouched by human hands, covered in dirt. After watering down the paint with a little bit of water, I had a dry paper towel and a wet paper towel for this process. I get the brush as wet as I can and then smear the paint into every available crevice and surface on the rock and then blot it out with a paper towel. This allows the paint to sink into the low spots and the crevices on the rock but leave the surface untouched. That way it gives a realistic look to where dirt must have actually accumulated on the rock. I usually use this color to give the imitation of faux rust, and so it was a little orangey for my taste. I decided to opt for a darker brown instead. This color is burnt umber and it looks a lot more like dirt. I had been worried so far because the metallic paints ended up making the whole rock look just like a big blob of molten aluminum, but adding in the weathering really seemed to tone down the shininess. It dulled down the sheen and gave it a look that was much more realistic. I had to do this for the entire surface of the rock. Though this really seemed to work nicely, I noticed that the rock was lacking a little bit of contrast and depth. It just needed some more different colors to kind of bring the whole thing together. A real rock doesn't stick to one color scheme. Even after weathering, I still noticed that the rock was a little bit too shiny, so I decided to use this dark gray instead to tone it down even more. The key here is to be very sporadic about the application of the paint. No concentration in one area more than another, just kind of all over the place. I was very happy with the result, but I still wanted to add a little bit more light to it, so I decided to go over it with this kind of creamed coffee color. I used the same dry brushing technique here, just skimming over the surface to catch the highlights. I was so happy with the result, and the look was so realistic I couldn't believe it. However, I just wanted to give one final touch to tie the whole project together and give it a look of realism. With this dark and light green watered down paint, I decided to go in and catch the bottom parts of the rock to make it look like moss had grown up the sides. My camera doesn't quite pick up the subtle addition, but I was very happy that I included it. It looks so realistic. The camera doesn't do a very good job of picking up how I blended everything together, so it looks a little patchy. But all that was left to do to finish out the rock was to add a couple of coats of this matte clear spray.
Oh, and it is lovely. modest budget. I like that boulder. That is a nice boulder.
I still had to cast the coins, so enjoy this footage of an aluminum bottle melting. I used a 2-part mold like I did for the sword to make the coins, and the result turned out much nicer. All I'd have to do is just sand and clean the edges of these. The finished result takes a lot of effort and a lot of work, but it's definitely worth it in the end. Now it's time to finally finish off the sword. After grinding off all the flashing on the outside, I wanted to paint the hilt and the pommel gold. The paint did not like to stick to the butcher's string even after a layer of PVA glue, so I'll have to try something different in the future.
So before I show you all the finished project, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone that made this all possible. Without your help, I would not be where I am today, so for everything you've done for me, I am eternally grateful. I am so excited to keep filming the progress on future projects, so if you're interested in contributing, I'm happy to announce that I've launched my Patreon. Patrons receive access to behind-the-scenes content, real-time vlogs, and they're entered into some drawings for cool free stuff. Stay tuned for the project recap video and for voting on which project I should work on next. The links to my Facebook and Instagram are down below so you can cast your vote. Otherwise, I am so happy with how this project turned out, so I'll see you all at the Nebraska State Fair on August 28th. Things always eat my money, I tell you what. How many silver coins do I gotta put in this thing? How many pieces? How many? Come on! Right, one more.